My guest again today is Donna Laframboise.
Well, for the last 3 years, I have been busy on a project here in Canada about the amazing trucker convoy that happened in early 2022. It changed the trajectory of the pandemic for us here in Canada. But it's very interesting as someone who is used to be a mainstream media journalist. I have been surprised and appalled at how the trucker convoy got covered because it was part of the COVID era. And so the media decided to be on the government side against ordinary people who were protesting government overreach. You know, the media is supposed to stand up for the little guy, and instead that's not what happened. So when I went to Ottawa to be part of that, to photograph that protest because it went on for 3 weeks. And you know, we would walk around and we would talk to truckers, and I would take tons of photos, and people would be laughing and weeping and dancing, and there was all of this love and positive energy and people sharing and supporting each other. And then we'd go back to the hotel room and turn on that television set, and the media would be talking about far-right white supremacists who were terrorists and were terrorizing Ottawa citizens. And it was incredibly hostile coverage, and it was exactly the opposite of what I had just spent hours experiencing. So then I thought the media was going to snap out of it, and okay, heat of the moment, everyone's going to calm down. A few months later, we'll start to talk about that protest in an honest and accurate way. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen. So then I thought, well, I guess maybe I'm going to have to write a book that tells the stories of the ordinary people who participated in this historic event, because no one else is going to tell their stories. So I went out and interviewed people. So I have the stories of about 20 truckers, just ordinary folk who got in their truck and drove to Ottawa, some from thousands of miles away in middle of winter, minus 30, biting winds. It was a terrible time of year to be protesting outdoors, but they did it because Canadians can be pretty hardy if we need to be. So 20 truckers, and then a bunch of stories about the people who helped the truckers, because those guys told me there's no way they could have stayed for 3 weeks in Ottawa under those conditions without this amazing support from ordinary Canadians. So my book, if you don't mind me just holding it up for a second, is called Thank You Truckers, Canada's Heroes and Those Who Helped Them, because this really is a story of Canada at a particular moment in time. And it's heartwarming, and it's encouraging, and it's inspiring. And right now we could all use a bit of that in our lives, because so many other things are going on that are quite depressing in the world.
So the media has not told the true story to this day. Even right now, it was a bunch of Nazis and racists.
Yes, pretty much. That's it. Yes, it's hard to believe, but yes, when in fact it was just ordinary people who had had enough, who said it's time to move on. Especially here in Canada, it was like our politicians and health authorities were on this hamster wheel. They kept going round and round and round, and they couldn't figure out how to get off. So in early January of 2022, almost 2 years after the pandemic hit, only one Canadian province out of 10 sent school kids back to school after the Christmas break on schedule. And we had unions calling for another hard lockdown. We had doctors saying it was a matter of life and death. We better have another hard lockdown. And life was getting even more restrictive for people who didn't have the proper number of vaccines. So it was, some people now say, oh, the truckers weren't necessary. Things were fading away. No, they weren't actually. If you go look at those headlines from January 2022, just before they got in their big rigs and thundered across the country, it was not getting better. It was still getting worse.
So it had global implications, don't you think? It rippled out beyond Canada, I think. Yeah.
It did, yes. People were watching from all over the world, and people, I think, were saying, well, if those polite, quiet Canadians have had enough, maybe we've had enough too. And so suddenly there were demonstrations all over the world with people with Canadian flags. I remember this huge big Canada flag in Manhattan, where some people were demonstrating against vaccine mandates. So, America often doesn't really notice what we're doing up here, but for that one shining moment of about 4 weeks in the winter of 2022, the eyes of the world were on Canada, and we were inspiring people, and we were cool. Canada isn't cool very often. And the great thing about it is that we were cool because not because of anything any politician had done, but because ordinary people, working people stood up and said, enough, let's move on.
So how about the horror stories of ordinary people who just donated and got their accounts frozen? I'm amazed that that happened.
Yes. So, I have to be honest. I wasn't looking for those stories. So I interviewed a number of truckers who had their bank accounts frozen. I personally have not found any person who donated money and got their bank account frozen. So I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I personally haven't run across it. But many, many people were concerned because they had donated to an online, Give, Send, Go, and that material got hacked. So suddenly there were private individuals with their addresses, with the amount of money that they had donated, and it was out there in the wild. And that was criminal activity that resulted in that material becoming public, and our media used that material. There was no compelling public interest to say that a police officer had donated $50 or that political staffer had donated $100 and lost their jobs, because that's what the media docks them, and then that's what happened. So, and one of the truckers, he has a couple sons who were under 16 at the time. And so your parents have to be on your bank account, right? The parent's name. So those teenage kids got their bank account frozen because dad's name was on their bank account. And in another case, a gentleman who was protesting for 3 weeks, he had his name on his elderly parents' account. So, if they get sick, he can continue to pay their bills. He could manage their investments. All of those bank accounts got frozen from his elderly parents, who you can imagine were pretty distressed by that. They were calling him a couple times a day. When is this going to end? What about my pension deposit? This was a really, really distressing situation for these older people some of whom were immigrants from the former Soviet Union. So they were really, really freaking out, and who had not set foot in Ottawa themselves. So the freezing of the bank accounts was just an incredible violation of civil liberties, and really, really frightened people, and made all of us, I think, in Canada rethink our relationship to banks. Because, if your bank is just going to listen to the government, and there's going to be no trial, there's going to be no even charges laid, no trial, just the bank is just going to flip a switch, and suddenly you don't have access to your money. That's a big wake-up call.
Do you think a lot of people were woken up by being there and seeing what it was like, and then contrasting that with the media coverage, and then they're starting to think, what else are they lying to us about?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So many people said that. I went with a friend who wasn't really political, and she walked around outside with me for hours, and then we'd come back and look at the television, and she'd say, I'm not watching the nightly news anymore. It's all bullshit, right? And there were so many people who said that, young people, old people. They said, I know the media's biased, but I didn't expect it to be like 180 degrees opposite, to what's actually going on. And yes, then everyone is saying, what can you trust? And I don't think that's a good place for us to be. If you can't trust anything in the media, then our shared understanding of what's going on collapses.
So you told a very interesting story, I think, on a different podcast about you were in some sort of journalism class with 30 plus people in it, and someone asked, so which of you came from a working class background?
So very, very early on, I was 19 years old. I was in first semester of journalism school, and we had a guest speaker who came in and said, there's a class issue in journalism, and I hadn't actually even thought about it. I didn't think of myself as poor. We were working class. My father was an auto mechanic. My mom didn't finish high school. There wasn't anyone in my life that I knew that got into university, but but we didn't lack. My parents worked very hard. So Yes. So it turns out I'm the only one in the class who's coming from a working class background, which helps explain a few things, I think. So when I went to Ottawa and I looked at all those people on the street, I knew what I was looking at. They're my family. This is people in my family look like this. But I think there were some bureaucrats who live and work in Ottawa. They're downtown, they're urbanites. Their family background is more educated, more professional. And I think those people might have been afraid because they've actually maybe not had much exposure to working class people. Maybe they call a plumber or an electrician a couple times in a decade. They don't really know any working class people. And so they looked at these folks out there and, dressed up because it was really cold. And they had been already coached by the media and by the politicians to think of them as dangerous. And so it's too bad. I think there was a problem there. Yeah.
Yeah, so the people that live there, I think you said some of them were afraid to go out of their houses maybe, but the reality was it was bouncy castles and normal people and no danger at all, correct? Yeah.
That's right. It was absolutely family friendly. And to have a large group of people together for 3 weeks and not have any serious incidents, not have any fist fights. You go to a music festival and those kinds of things happen. This was 3 weeks of very, very peaceful people. So yeah. So, but everyone was telling these people, it's dangerous out there. It's dangerous out there. And there's these stories of someone taking their elderly mother. Well, Mom, why don't you just come out and, we'll go walk for a couple blocks. And then their view of what's going on out there is totally changed.
So I want to make sure I understand what brought the people there to protest. Was it all about the COVID gene therapy mandates and the lockdowns and all the other government control about COVID, or were there other issues too?
Well, so I think lots of people came with their own issues. So, for me, the issue might have been X, and for that person over there, it's a slightly different one. But it was basically 2 years of we are weary. We are weary of the pandemic. We are weary of all of these rules. And but for the truckers themselves, it was, these are the heroes who kept the economy going for 2 years. And especially at the beginning when it was scary and we didn't understand things, you're an essential worker. You have to keep working while the rest of us hide at home and protect ourselves. So these guys did that. And then suddenly, almost 2 years later, the government decides to stab them in the back and say, if you want to cross the border between America and Canada, you must be vaccinated. And remember, we have a very long shared border. So it makes sense for people in British Columbia to ship down to Oregon. It makes sense for people in Ontario to ship down to Michigan rather than shipping across both countries. So there's a lot of goods going back and forth across the border. And so suddenly it's January 15th. If you don't have your 2 vaxes plus 2 weeks, as a trucker, when you come back into Canada, you're going to have to quarantine for 14 days. Well, obviously, they can't earn a living because some of these guys are crossing the border a couple times a week in both directions, right? So that was what the truckers were most concerned about. We've had enough. But other people came for their own reasons. So one of the truckers told me that he'd met a young woman on the East Coast. She was just graduating high school. She'd received a COVID shot and suddenly her health had deteriorated dramatically and she was in a wheelchair now. And so he'd gone to a protest about lockdowns. He'd met this young woman who gave him her Canadian flag and said, would you please bring this flag to Ottawa for me? So he says that's why he went. And in another case, the gentleman, it started out very, very kind of casual and playful. He has a vintage Mac, which is very close to the old Mac in the Chris Christopherson Convoy movie from the late 70s. And his wife bought him a rubber ducky hood ornament rather than the traditional bulldog that's on a Mac. And so he's got this truck, and his friends are saying, there's a convoy. You should take your truck. There's a convoy. And everyone thought it was going to just be a weekend protest. They thought they'd go to Ottawa, talk to some government officials, be heard, and go home again. You should go. You should go. So he says, well, it's in a snowbank. I'm going to dig it out. We'll see. If it starts, I'll go. If it doesn't, I won't. So he digs it out and he gets some heaters and some torches and some cables and he puts it all. And he says, and the darn thing started. So then I went to Ottawa. And in that case, his wife was urging him to go because she was very concerned. Quebec was talking about fining people who were not vaccinated. And she said, so I'm thinking about how am I going to help my mother pay these fines? So his wife, the Mac driver's wife, was very supportive. But then he said, when we got there and we realized how grateful other Canadians were that we were there. And then, so they at first people started saying, thank you so much for coming. This is amazing. Thank you so much. And then it flipped to, please don't go. Please stay. We have to end this crap. Please stay. So he says, so then after a couple of days, we started to take this very seriously. And then he was, and people are giving him money and they're bringing him socks. And I think at one point they found out that this gentleman's, the heat in the Mac doesn't work very well. So they were bringing him pants. I think he says he has like dozens of pairs of pants still 3 years later that he hasn't worn. So everyone was not everyone, but many Canadians, ordinary Canadians were saying, this is important. How can we help? What do you need? It was 3 weeks of if paradise exists, I caught a glimpse of that in Ottawa, really, truly.
So do you think there's a dynamic where the truckers were kind of the perfect people to do this because they're independent people for one thing, and they have the courage to do it, and they spent a lot of time traveling around and seeing that the rules were different everywhere you went, and was this really science or was it just politics?
What you just said is just exactly true. Exactly true. They tend to be independent thinkers. They're traveling around. They're seeing that there's very different rules south of the Canadian border, and the other thing is that they're no nonsense people. They have to get things done. They're often on schedules. They're get them done folk. So yeah, they were. And when we have a national disaster, a hurricane or a flood, it's the working class guys who come and rescue us, right? That's the role they play in our society. It's one of the roles they perform. So these were working class guys rescuing us in a different way, rescuing us from the pandemic excesses. So I think there's some poetry there.
Yeah, I think there's a bigger issue here where I think there's a lot of people living in an academic world or in a political world where they're not in touch with the real world. They don't have to make things happen in the real world and suffer the consequences. I think that's so important that these people understood the real world.
That's right. That's right. These are the people who build things, who fix things, who move things, who get things done. And some of the things that were accomplished, by ordinary people. So there were a few farmers who let the truckers, hang out. So sometimes they just wanted to come out of the city at night and have a quieter place to hang out. But the city of Ottawa was saying, is there someplace? So there were farmers within an hour of Ottawa who, you can use my land for that. And suddenly all the neighbors are pitching in and they are plowing 80 acres of field for the trucks to pull into. So, and they're bringing over these huge event tents that someone had used for a wedding, and they're linking them up, and they're bringing over generators, and they're bringing over huge urns of coffee urns. So this community spirit and getting things done, like really getting, and suddenly a truck pulls up and there's 4 porta potties on the back. And then someone is coming every 3 days to empty those porta potties. Like just all of these things happened, and there was no planning committee. There was no, no one's being paid. It all just happened because this is the class of people who knows how to get stuff done.
So on a more somber note, how did we end up getting Mark Carney after all this? What happened?
Dear.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened. Well, one of the things that happened is there is a thread in the Canadian personality, and that's that there are some people who have a very knee-jerk, hostile attitude towards America. So there are some people who are very smug and sanctimonious, and they think that the important thing about Canada is that we're not America, which, you know, I personally don't have very much sympathy or patience for, but that is part of our character. And one of the reasons historically is that during the Vietnam War, a bunch of the draft dodgers who came north then became professors. And so they brought some anti-American analysis with them and then inculcated generations of educated Canadians. So anti-Americanism is an unfortunate part of the Canadian psyche.
A follow-up question is, do you trust that you really did vote in Mark Carney? Do you trust the election results?
Well, I think the election results are there are many of us now who are questioning them, but Mark Carney played on the anti-Americanism. Okay, so Trump was making some unfortunate comments about about Canada becoming the 51st state, and the media just ran with that and amplified that, and so Mark Carney posed as the person who was going to stand up to Trump and stand up to American aggression, and it was all very silly. But there were sufficient Canadian voters apparently who took it seriously and voted accordingly. And yes, we have some concerns about how Mark Carney won the leadership of the Liberal Party after Justin Trudeau stepped down, and then we have some concerns about how the election results were tallied and votes that weren't counted. And this is new for Canada, or certainly new for me. I've never been concerned that our elections might be compromised until now. And that's not a comfortable place for us to be.
I want to read just a little bit from the Wall Street Journal, what they said about Mark Carney. Here it is, quote, Mark Carney's shift from climate change warrior to fossil fuel cheerleader. Canada's prime minister scraps green policies and pledges to transform country into energy superpower. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Do you think he's stepping back at all from the climate scam?
What's the date on that?
October 4 is when I put it up. Probably, about October 4. It blows my mind. Yeah, I don't know.
I'd like to see evidence of that. That would be, in my opinion, a very good change of policy, but I don't see it yet. I don't see it. We have, we don't have any pipelines going on because there are many different reasons, ways in which they are discouraged. So we have these emission caps legislation, and we have all of this environmental, you jump through these environmental hoops and you spend millions on this environmental assessment and that environmental assessment, and then they decide that's not sufficient and you got to do something else now. And also, we have a government that has been for the last 10 years very, very anti-oil. And that means they're also very anti-Alberta because that's the lifeblood of the Alberta economy. So, all of that is a problem. And when the government is anti-oil, then lots of other Canadians are anti-oil too, because they're just exposed to that philosophy and they don't hear any counter arguments. So oil is very difficult. It's what makes our economy run. It's what pays for our hospitals and Canada is a broken place right now.
And I like to ask Canadians this, as you walk around talking to real people in Canada, do you think they're actually seriously concerned that Canada is getting too hot? They're worried about warm weather in Canada.
No, we're not. No, we're not. We take every opportunity to go south, somewhere warm to vacation. I don't think Canadians are. Yes, and we have these fluctuations in what happens with the weather, like everyone else. So it was very dry in my part of Canada for most of August and September, and it was very discouraging for the farmers, but they shrug and say, well, that's what it's like some days, some years, right? It's just normal.
So some of my newer viewers might not know that you are a climate change skeptic, or you've written at least a couple books in detail about the IPCC and Pachari and that type of thing. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Sure. So I had left journalism For a number of years, I was a newspaper reporter. Written magazine work. I'd written a book, and then I'd left journalism and went and did something else. But I was still an informed person, and so I would be reading all of this climate change coverage in places like The Economist magazine, which used to be a really good publication back in the day. But they started all of this gratuitous climate commentary about, of course, everything's going to be different because of climate change. And, you'd read a book review, and then at the end, they would be talking about climate change, even though the book had nothing to do with about that. And so I started doing some research of my own, because my sense was there's a bigger picture here. There are different sides of the climate issue, and we're just hearing one, and the public deserves to hear the other side and to make up their own mind, or other perspectives. So then, I don't have a PhD in physics or geology or any other thing that would be relevant to climate change. So how can I assess what's going on? And so, because I can't assess the science, I decided to look at a very important organization called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. It's a UN body. Almost no one has heard of it. So I was in this bizarre space of having written a book, now 2 books, about an organization most Canadians, most ordinary people have never heard of. But it's a very important organization because they write these reports about what's happening with the climate. And then all the governments of the world point to those reports and say, we have to cut emissions. We have to worry about greenhouse gases because of this UN body's report. So it's incredibly influential, even though it's pretty obscure. And as a journalist, I just started looking at their press releases, or what people involved said about the IPCC. We base all of our analysis on peer-reviewed, published scientific research. And then the closer I looked, I thought, no, that there's a reference that's not peer reviewed, and there's a reference that's actually a press release, and there's a reference that's a newspaper clipping. So I ended up organizing a bit of a crowdsourcing project in which 40 wonderful human beings from all over the world helped me examine the references in an earlier report. Now, this is about probably going back 15 years, the report, because my first book was 14 years old now. And we discovered that a large percentage, like depending on where you looked, 20 or 30 or 40% of the references were not, in fact, to peer-reviewed literature. And that was a big fat lie. And the head of the IPCC was going around the world making this claim repeatedly in speeches all over the place. And I have one little bit of satisfaction, and that's that after our research came out and became public, and Fox News contacted the IPCC and said, do you have a comment on this? They declined to comment, but they never again made that particular claim in public. So yay, small victories. And then there were other things, that, we're the world's top scientists writing these IPCC reports. Well, there were some very prominent scientists, but there were also a whole bunch of other people who were lead authors and who were still finishing their PhD or still working on their masters, and they may have been great scientists, but if you can't, as an organization, describe yourself, your policies, and your personnel accurately, then I don't think I need to look at your report, because if you can't tell me who you are in an accurate fashion, I don't have any faith that your report is going to be accurate either.
So I don't know if you mentioned the whole name of the book, but it's The Delinquent Teenager Who Was Mistaken for the World's Top Climate Expert. And I wanted to share something about this because my wife and I did an anniversary getaway around 2011 when your book came out. And one thing we did is we just wanted to stay off the internet and read books. So I spent a weekend reading your book. It's very well written. And
oh my goodness. Oh, that's awesome.
And it had an effect. I mean, it's great that out of all the people who could have done this, you actually did it. You crowdsourced it and checked it because nobody else checked to see if it was peer reviewed, right?
That's right. Yes. Amazing. So there were just so many things that made you go, And all the accolades around the IPCC. It's the, it's the gold standard. There's nothing more transparent. All of this rhetoric turned out to be just hot air. So that was pretty amazing.
And they did win half of a Nobel Peace Prize for this, right?
That's right. They did. Yes. And it's interesting though, because I think if we went back to, was it 2009 where they got the Nobel, the Peace Prize that
Sounds
year?
right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and, Al Gore made a speech, did he, on that occasion? I think he did.
I think he did. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you look at what he was saying back then, and then you compare it to what actually happened over the next decade or so, I think that would be a very interesting exercise.
Do people really care about IPCC reports? I think they don't. I remember back then that the media was super excited about the reports, but now I don't know if people in the scientific world they're super excited to be part of the IPCC, or what do you think?
I'm not sure. I think maybe the prestige has faded a bit. And my understanding is that in the U.S. the funding has been cut off. So American scientists were probably at least half of the personnel working on these reports. And if that funding has been cut off and those personnel have been told, no, you can't use your time at work to participate in these reports, it will be interesting to see what happens in the near future with them.
What are you working on now? Or any more books in the hopper, or what stuff are you looking at these days?
I am, after spending 3 years writing Thank You Truckers, the challenge this year is to let people know about this book, because I don't exist as far as the mainstream media is concerned. They just, it's radio silence. No one's talking about this book. So I just finished an 8 community tour with another journalist who'd written a slightly different book about it's called Unjustified, the Emergencies Act. So we did an 8 town tour. And so not one of these events was in a bookstore. So we held events that were organized by people in these different communities, and we went to cafes, we went to farms, we gathered in people's homes, we gathered in a church, a Baptist church, and we had a book event, and talked about the book, and met people and signed some copies and sold some copies. But not one of those events was in a bookstore. So that's very interesting, that if you're trying to tell people about a book that is off narrative, right? The books, you have to do it some other way. And it's quite interesting and lovely, because every event had its own ambiance and its own group of people. And in one case, half of the audience was former Polish people or Czechoslovakian people who had fled communism. And so, when they were looking at COVID and what was happening with the government, those people were really, really distressed, because they could smell what they had fled from. So I'm trying to promote the book, and I'm trying to let people know, and I'm trying to suggest gently that maybe this would be a great gift for Christmas with the holidays coming up. I did a bit of, I was filmed for 2 hours for a documentary that's coming out that Trish Wood is doing, and she's a former mainstream media journalist who is doing this documentary that's very much in sync. There's real people here. There's wonderful stories. If I could tell you just one story from Ottawa, would that be okay?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, we were told that these were a bunch of racists. Well, one of the gentlemen who sat in his blue Peterbilt on Wellington Street for 3 weeks happens to be an immigrant from Jamaica with a lovely Caribbean accent. And he came, I think, when he was in his early 20s. His wife is an immigrant as well. So I think she came to Canada when she was 16. These are people who are hardworking, who are trying to build a brand new life in a brand new country. And suddenly they're both out of work because of vaccine mandates. And so they hear about this protest and they say, well, we got to be part of this. I guess other people are thinking the way we are. So they go to Ottawa, and they're in a very perilous financial position because they're both out of work now, and they don't know when this is going to end. And it's not because of racism. It's because of government discrimination, government segregation. You cannot do things unless you get these shots. You know, one size fits all medicine, right? So they're sitting there in their Peterbilt, and disaster happens. They have a very expensive component fail on their truck, and they don't have a lot of money, and it's starting to ice up inside their truck, and it's like, oh my goodness, what do we do? So a friend happens to come by, and they tell this friend about their problem, and the friend says, I'm going to call my boss. Now, this gentleman, the boss is in Hamilton, which is probably a 5-hour drive from Ottawa. And so that gentleman, who is a complete stranger, hears about this problem and orders that truck part. It's a $4,000 truck part. And he orders it from the other side of the country, from British Columbia. It gets shipped to him in Hamilton. And then that gentleman gets in his own pickup truck and he drives it to Ottawa, and he gifts this $4,000 truck part to these two people that he's never met, complete strangers, and rescues them and saves them. And it's a miracle in their life. And eventually, by the time I interview them later, they say, once we got back on our feet, we paid this guy back. But at that time, it was a miracle. So those are the kinds of things that were going on out there on the streets in that bitter cold during the Freedom Convoy. This is what Canadians were doing for each other. It was amazing.
Yeah, as I read your work, I think you do a great job of making me feel like I was there as I go through. It's almost 500 pages. And for whatever reason, I was doing other stuff at the time. I wasn't staying informed. But reading now, with looking back at it from years later, I do feel like I was there. So you did a great job.
Wonderful.
I'm wondering if you have any plans to turn it into an Audible book. I know that'd be a lot of work, but I think a lot of people would listen.
I think you're right. You're right, because truck drivers too tend to be very interested in Audible books. So that is on the list of things that I would like to address in the next few weeks. So yes, thank you for mentioning that.
Fantastic.
And if I may also just point out, so what did you think of the QR codes at the end of every chapter? Did you take a peek at those?
I did. I took a peek, and they brought me to your Substack, or the ones I did. I looked at. I went, and then I looked at pictures on your Substack, right?
Yeah. So there's lots and lots of photos associated with this event, and so at the end of every chapter, I have a very short URL, or also a QR code. So if you're reading with your tablet or your phone, you can just scan that QR code, and there is a page online for every chapter, which shows you this is the trucker you've just been reading about, and this is his truck, and these are the signs on his truck, and that story about thawing sausages by some stranger pulling up and saying, how can we help? Well, I have all these sausages. They need to be thawed before I can cook them. So the strangers bring their car, and they lift the hood, and they start the engine, and they put the sausages on. So you can see the photo of that when at the end of that chapter, if you scan the QR code. So I think it's really a very an enriched experience where you can read about these people and then go take a look at the pictures. And often there's lovely pictures, and there's extensive pictures.
That's right. Yeah. So you're a photographer as well, right? Did you take many of the pictures yourself?
I took some of the pictures, and then many of them people gave to me because, they're describing this thawing the sausages. They took that photo at the time. I wasn't there for that event. So many of the photos were while I was interviewing people, they would say, and here's the photo of when that happened. Here's the photo of when that happened. So the photos are a collection. And that's one of the reasons they're online, because to publish a photo in a book, you actually need the permission of whoever took it. And in many cases, we don't actually know who's the precise person who took the photo.
So how did the whole event wrap up? Or they were hoping to talk to Trudeau, but that never happened? Or how did it end?
Yeah, so that is one of the, the unfortunate things. So they're there, they're peaceful for 3 weeks. All they want is to talk to someone in government. They have driven thousands of miles. They have spent thousands of dollars on diesel fuel to get there. All they want is to speak to their government, someone from the federal government to come out and talk to them and hear them. And that never happened. They were treated like mangy dogs, because once your prime minister frames you as unacceptable fringe minority that's racist and homophobic and God knows what else, all the other bad terrorists and violent and all those other names that you're being called, then the government has painted itself into a picture. How can it go meet with those deplorables, right? So that's what happened. That is what happened. So eventually the government incredibly invokes the Emergencies Act. Like, this is martial law. This is supposed to be when there is sabotage, when there is so much disorder that neither the police nor the military can deal with it. There are very strict criteria for invoking this particular act, and in its current form, it has never been used before. But rather than going and talking to people, the Trudeau government pulled in thousands of police officers from around the country. They're paying them overtime, they're paying their transportation, they're paying hotel rooms, they're paying them per diems, their meals. A huge amount of money wasted to get all of those extra police officers in Ottawa, and then they physically beat up people and arrested them and towed the trucks away. There was a great deal of violence on the part of the police. It was appalling what happened. Then none of the demonstrators were charged with assault. No one was charged with assaulting police. The violence went one way only, and it is a huge stain on Canada, what happened. And then, then the insanity started. The insanity was that we've spent 3 weeks telling these truckers to go home. Well, once you seize their trucks, you won't let those trucks out for 7 days. And 7 days to the hour. So if the truck got seized in the afternoon, don't show up at the impound lot at 7 in the morning, because they won't give it to you till it's 7 days to the hour. So and they're charging you about $200 a day for storage fees, right? So this happens, and then the lawfare starts. So there are a number of court cases that have only wrapped up in the last few months with the truckers 3.5 years later. So we're talking tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. We're talking enormous amounts of travel time. So this one guy, with the Mack truck from Nova Scotia, he traveled between Nova Scotia and Ottawa. That's 3 provinces over for court, more than a dozen times over 3 years. He's losing his ability to work because he has to be in court. And last week, I was in the courthouse in Ottawa when the 2 organizers, the most prominent people who were charged, were sentenced. So they were there for 3 weeks. The judge agrees. They were very cooperative with the police. They continually and persistently told people to be peaceful and loving and not aggressive. But the judge said that they had committed serious mischief. And so they were sentenced to 1 year of house arrest. So you can leave your house to work and for some medical appointments and some religious services, but otherwise 5 hours a week to go do your shopping, and otherwise you're under house arrest for an entire year, followed by 6 months of curfew, 10 p.m. at night to 5 a.m. in the morning. So so we were in the courtroom, and we were delighted that they were not sent to jail, because the Crown Attorney, which is our prosecutors, were asking for 7 and 8 years in penitentiary for these 2 people. Nonviolent protesters. And instead they got a year of house arrest plus another half year of curfew. So here we are, more than 3.5 years after the convoy, and the lawfare continues. There are still some cases that are going through the courts. And, when police arrest someone, they say, and the person is protesting, they say, you're going to get your day in court. Don't worry, you'll get your day in court. Well, these protesters would go to court. They'd go through all the stress and expense of going to court. They'd tell their story before a judge. The judge would acquit them. of mischief. And then the prosecutors would appeal that acquittal. That's how insane and how politicized the Crown attorneys, the prosecutors have been in Ottawa around these cases. Insane. The amount of money squandered, millions upon millions.
So, is there hope that this lawfare will stop? Do you have any hope?
I hope so. I think one of the people who was sentenced last week is talking about appealing her conviction, and if she does, then everything starts again. And now the gentleman. So there was Tamara Leach from Alberta, and then the gentleman was Chris Barber from Saskatchewan. Now the Crown is continuing. They want to seize his truck. So his truck came across the Western Canada at the head of the Western Convoy and parked in downtown Ottawa where the police told him to park. And I think about halfway through the demonstration, that prolonged protest, he actually moved his truck to a farm. So he wasn't honking his horn. His truck wasn't in anyone's way. There was no crime committed, right? But they're trying to seize his truck, and his truck is what he runs he runs this small trucking business. He goes across the border. About 60% of his business is cross-border trucking, and they're trying to seize his truck. It reminds me of, in old Westerns, when someone steals your horse, you deserve the death penalty. So that's what's going on here. The Canadian government is trying to seize this man's truck, and it continues. He's back in court in November. So it goes on, and I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. Some days it's difficult to have hope, to feel hope, because it's insane. It's insane what we've become.
Do you see a lot of parallels at all between these protesters and the January 6th protesters in the U.S.?
A few. I think before the convoy, the Western Convoy reached Ottawa, and that was the one that took a week. Okay, but it's worth mentioning that police were watching and monitoring, and they expected 5 convoys from different parts of the country to converge on Ottawa. Well, 13 convoys converged on Ottawa that weekend, and there's reason to believe that in Quebec, the police sent some other convoys down blind alleys, and there would have been even more. And they closed the bridges from Quebec into Ottawa. Ottawa's right on the river. The other side is Quebec. They closed all those bridges, which meant that none of those trucks could get in. So, and before they got there, the politicians were trying to frame it as a January 6th, as an insurrection, people trying to take over the government. And, there was just nothing like that happened. Like they didn't, like the convoy organizers themselves were saying, don't even enter a federal building. We don't need that. We don't want that exposure. We're going to protest very peacefully on the streets. So, so at January 6th, like a lot of people subsequently, basically got swatted in the middle of the night, right? Because they happened to be protesting on that day, and they happened to be in Ottawa or in Washington. So that kind of thing did not happen. We had an interim police chief during the protest who said that anyone bringing food or money to the truckers was going to be hunted down. There was some of that rhetoric. It didn't happen, partly because, the police have better things to do, actually, than go chase you down because you were at a perfectly peaceful protest a year ago, right? So the Hutterites. So we have Hutterites in our Western provinces around Manitoba. There's a nice, there's a concentration of them in southern Manitoba, and Hutterites usually remain aloof. They don't get involved in the community around them. They don't get involved in politics. They live their own life. They have their own worldview, and they remain aloof. But they were very concerned, like other Canadians, about what was going on during COVID. And so when those truckers came across the prairies, the Hutterites decided to feed them. And they, so a number of colonies got together, and there were pails of potato salad There was pails of soup, and there was sausages, and I think there were 4 pigs that were roasted and turned into pulled pork. And they were waiting there at a service station where they had understood that the truckers were going to come through. And so they set up, they had all this food, and their idea was they were going to bring a plate to the trucker window. And then the truckers would just drive through. And it was so packed with people there because there was such enthusiasm from members of the public that the police decided it might be too dangerous. And really, when people were, there were times when people were lined up on both sides of the highway, and there were concerns about hitting people. So the police said it's too dangerous. They closed the service station, and the trucks had to keep rolling a couple hours down the highway. And so the Hutterites packed up all that food, and they too drove down the highway, crossed a provincial border into the next province, and they set up all of this food in the parking lot of a recreation center in -20 at 10 p.m. at night, and they fed the truckers. And that story is, for them to do that's historic. That alone makes this protest, gives it historical and social significance. So they did this, and there's a chapter in my book in which Ben, the Hutterite, describes these events from his perspective. And he says, we felt that closure was a gift from God. Because when we drove down the highway, we got to see all of those Canadians on overpasses, waving Canadian flags. And this is something Canadians have never experienced. We aren't patriotic the way Americans are. So this is very unusual. And he said, we got to experience that. And then when we got to the rec center, we got to talk to the truckers, whereas before we would have just brought something to their window and they would have moved on. But everyone got to talk to each other, and we made these friendships, and we learned about each other. And it was just, in his words, it was a gift from God that had happened that way. And so, these are just wonderful stories about a moment in Canadian history. And I think, they deserve to be documented. I'm happy to have documented them. And I hope that people get to enjoy them and take a little bit of inspiration from them.
So the word that keeps coming to my mind as I hear you talk about this and as I read your book is heartwarming. Is that,
Yes.
Would you use that word to sum up the whole thing, or what other word would be good?
I would. So friends have said, Donna, this is sort of like chicken soup for the soul. Every page has got another wonderful story of someone being kind and generous. So I think it is a heartwarming book, even though the backdrop is a bit serious.
Very nice. Okay. Anything else you want to say before we finish up?
I just like to thank you, Tom, for the invitation to talk about this and for everything you're doing. You're a force of nature right now. All the podcasts you're doing and everything else. It's I'm very happy to know you, and thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much as well. We'll talk to you next time.